The torches burned low in the halls of the Hotel St. Paul, flickering against stone walls as the royal attendants hushed their voices. Somewhere in the corridors, a scream split the silence, a wretched, feral sound. The servants knew better than to react. They had grown accustomed to the horrors of this place, the cries that echoed in the night, the wild-eyed spectre of a king who no longer knew his own name. Charles VI of France was pacing again, his fingers tangled in his once golden hair, now dull with neglect. His garments were soiled, his nails jagged from clawing at his own skin. In his mind, demons whispered, voices clawing at the edges of his sanity. Some days he believed he was made of glass, convinced that the slightest touch would shatter him into 1,000 jagged shards. Other days, he forgot who he was entirely, recoiling from his own family as if they were strangers, his eyes brimming with terror at the sight of his own reflection. The kingdom he had once ruled was crumbling, as broken as his mind. The English pressed upon France's borders as the 100 Years' War dragged on. The Burgundians and the Armagnacs fought for control of a kingdom left leaderless by a king who had become a ghost of himself. He had not always been this way. Once, he had been the beloved, young, golden-haired, handsome. At 21, he had ridden into battle with fire in his eyes, a ruler with a bright future. He was the hope of France, a king who promised unity and prosperity after years of regency. But fate had other plans. It began with a journey to Brittany. The sun beat down upon the royal procession as they moved through a dense forest. The clang of armor, the rhythmic clopping of hooves. Charles rode at the front, his gaze fixed ahead, and then a hand clattered against steel. A page's lance fell from his grip, crashing onto the hard earth with a resounding clank. The sound cracked something deep within Charles. He turned, his eyes wide, unseeing. And then he attacked. With a sudden, wild fury, he drew his sword and turned on his own men. His knights screamed his name, pleaded for him to stop, but he saw only enemies. His blade struck flesh, blood spattered his tunic, and his rage did not subside until his own men wrestled him to the ground. When he came to, his hands were slick with crimson. His trusted friend and knight had fallen to his own blade. The world blurred. The king wept. This was the beginning. The episodes came and went in waves. At times he was lucid, laughing and drinking with his nobles, attending councils, speaking of France's future. But then darkness would creep in, and his mind would slip once more into the abyss. He would scream at shadows, flee from those who loved him. The worst of it, perhaps, was the glass delusion. He would sit in his chamber for days, refusing to move, terrified that if he so much as turned his head too quickly, his fragile body would crack and shatter into dust. The court whispered of curses. The House of Valois, they said, was tainted. Madness had gripped their bloodline before. Philip the Fair's sons had all died without heirs, leading to the 100 Years' War itself. Charles's grandfather, King John II, had fallen into despair and paranoia during his captivity in England, and now Charles VI bore the full weight of that legacy. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to hold the kingdom together, but she was outmaneuvered by scheming nobles. The Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Orléans, they all circled like wolves, each hungry for power, each willing to plunge France deeper into chaos. The Armagnac-Burgundian civil war tore the land apart, spilling blood in the name of a king who no longer ruled. In Paris, the people suffered. Plague festered in the narrow streets, famine gripped the countryside. The people needed a leader, but their king had become a shadow. They no longer called him the beloved. Now, he was the mad. By the time the English won at Agincourt in 1415, Charles was nothing more than a pawn in the hands of greater men. His own son, Charles VII, was cast aside when the Treaty of Troyes declared Henry V of England as heir to the French throne. The Dauphin fled south, rallying what forces he could, while his father remained a prisoner in his own palace, lost to the world, his mind adrift in endless torment. He lived like this for decades, a king in name only. When he died in 1422, there was little ceremony, little mourning. The Mad King was gone, and France remained divided. His son would fight to reclaim the throne, but the damage had already been done. The House of Valois would continue, but the curse of madness lingered. The bloodline was stained, and in time, another Charles would lose his grip on reality. Another king would fall to the darkness, and France would once again pay the price. And yet, beyond the halls of power, the people told another story. They whispered that Charles had not always been the mad spectre painted by history. There were those who still remembered his early years, the golden prince who had once been beloved. Some said his madness had been the work of sorcery, a curse cast upon him by unseen hands. Others believed he had simply carried too much weight, that the burdens of kingship had shattered him as surely as any blade. His daughter, Catherine, was wed to Henry V of England, binding France to its enemy. The son born of this union, Henry VI, would inherit not only the French crown, but the echoes of madness that had plagued Charles VI. In time, England too would feel the sting of a king lost to the depths of his own mind. As the years passed, the memory of Charles VI faded into legend. The Glass King, the cursed ruler, the madman who had lost his name. But in the shadows of the past, the question remained: was he truly mad, or was he simply a man crushed beneath the weight of a kingdom too great to bear? The legacy of Charles VI did not die with him. The divisions in France continued to bleed into the Renaissance, shaping conflicts that would stretch beyond his lifetime. The 100 Years' War would end, but its scars would remain. And the madness, whether seen as a divine punishment, an inherited affliction, or the consequence of an unbearable burden, would haunt the pages of history, a reminder that even kings are not immune to the fragility of the mind. And yet, in the long echo of history, his name remains a spectre, whispered through the halls of crumbling castles and the pages of forgotten chronicles. Was Charles VI simply the victim of his own mind, or was he a symbol of a kingdom that had already been lost long before his madness set in? The answer, buried beneath centuries of war and bloodshed, may never truly be known.